Statins are one of the most prescribed drugs in the entire world and have been for decades. However, what drug companies do not want you to know is that tens of millions of people report side effects every single year that can sometimes be more debilitating than the benefits they are hoping to derive. What I want to share with you are 8 specific side effects, all clinically backed with PubMed-based research studies that I'm going to link up for you here today so that you know that this is an unbiased look at the pros and cons of one of the most prescribed drugs in the entire world. So if you're not familiar with statins, they are used typically to lower cholesterol levels, usually lowering LDL, which is considered the bad or oxidized cholesterol. And they work by suppressing a specific enzymatic pathway. It's called HMG, coenzyme A reductase. And how this works is that, yes, it blocks and cuts down on cholesterol-based production and synthesis, but also it affects, which I'm going to talk about next, coenzyme A, mitochondria, neuron signaling, and more. So as we start to look through this, understand that I'm not saying that statins don't lower cholesterol. They do. They're actually highly effective at that. Now, is that a pro or a con? Well, as I've shared with you before, 50% of people who have a heart attack have high cholesterol. And the other 50%, you guessed it, they have normal or low cholesterol. So cholesterol is not always the best predictor of who's going to have a heart attack or heart disease or not. So much more goes into this, including inflammation, and I'll link up a specific show on why you must get your omega-6 to omega-3 levels under control. And again, I'll link that up in the show notes at stephencabral.com/3637, which are today's show, and all of the actual links to the studies will be there. All right, so let's dive right into it. Now that we know how these drugs work, we have to understand is that they actually lead to mitochondrial dysfunction and muscle-based breakdown. Why is this important? Keep in mind that after the age of about 27 years old, specifically for females and not too much further behind are men and women are going to lose about 5 pounds, so about a half a pound per year of muscle per decade. That is absolutely detrimental because we know that when people hit their 60s, 70s, and beyond, one of the biggest issues are falls, breaking a hip, losing their balance. All of those things tend to snowball people's decline when they have to go to rehabilitation. When they lose their mobility, they also lose a lot of that sense of independence. Now, also, again, keep in terms of mitochondria, it's our energy production. It's ATP. When people start taking statins, again, I'm not saying all people, I have to give you the disclaimer, I can't provide any medical advice, medical treatment, medical cures, medical diagnosis. They start getting fatigued after a few months or maybe a year walking up the stairs. Why? Because adenosine triphosphate, ATP, is produced by those mitochondria that are being shortchanged because of a lack of coenzyme A, right? Or CoQ10, I should say. CoQ10, coenzyme A, is part of the reductase-based chain that's being blocked by statin-based drugs. But that adenosine triphosphate in the mitochondria in the cells need CoQ10. And I'm sure you've probably heard of ubiquinol, ubiquinone. All of that is part of the energy and electron-based transfer that give us energy, especially short-term energy like lifting weights, doing push-ups, walking upstairs, doing a sprint, anything like short-term energy-based 30 to 60 seconds or less, we need our mitochondria for that. Now, here's the interesting thing. And again, I'm going to link up all these studies. This is called statin myopathy. So that's basically loss of strength, loss of muscle, the role of mitochondrial dysfunction. And again, all of these will be linked up. And this has been known for decades. It shows that increased oxidative stress through statin-based drugs, reduction in ATP production, leading to muscle pain, weakness, and exercise intolerance. And it shows that on muscle biopsies, regardless of symptoms or labs. Pretty outstanding. I mean, honestly, like not ideal. All right, next one we'll go over is statins increase insulin resistance and diabetes-based risk. I'm not saying they cause that, but they absolutely open the door to you being more susceptible. That's why how many people do you know not only have heart disease risk, but they also have type 2 diabetes and, wait for it, high blood pressure symptoms as well, right? So that's part of the metabolic syndrome that is created as people get older. not because of one thing, cholesterol, because the cholesterol isn't necessarily leading to the diabetes. It's not necessarily leading towards the high blood pressure. It is inflammation, but inflammation, of course, has its underlying root causes as well. Heavy metals, gut-based dysfunction, I'll talk about that in just a moment, but also those omega-6s to omega-3s that I'm always talking about because, again, it shows in the clinical literature, if you improve your omega-3 profile, you massively cut down on heart disease, right? Why? Because it cuts down on inflammation. Like, it's very straightforward as to how this works. All right, let's get back to it. So by using statin-based drugs, it impairs your GLUT4 translocation and insulin signaling. So this increases fatty acid accumulation. We don't want that in the cell membrane. It leads to higher fasting glucose levels. So basically your blood sugar is higher even while fasted overnight, which leads to weight gain, especially around the middle, increased hemoglobin A1C. Again, above that 5.7, you're moving towards type 2 diabetes. And new onset type 2 diabetes. So again, all of this, very, very important. I will link up all of the clinical evidence for people who like to go deeper at stephencabral.com/3637. All right, next one. This is extremely important. If you're worried about your long-term brain health, the brain contains about 25% of the body's cholesterol. So when we look at this, it's essential for your neurons in your brain, right? We need those for memories, for recall, right? So synapse formation, absolutely needed with cholesterol. Myelin integrity, the myelin sheath protects essentially the neurons, which are sending the signaling, the electrical impulses in the brain. And then neurotransmitter signaling is obviously affected if there's oxidative stress and there is breakdown there, which could lead to then dementia and other brain-based issues as you get older. Again, these are things that your doctor will most likely never share with you. So when you're deciding whether to use statin drugs or not, you need to weigh the pros and the cons. And again, I'm not saying that you should do nothing. You need to either take the natural alternative or the medical route. You get to decide. It shouldn't just be your doctor deciding for you. All right. The next one is memory loss, cognitive impairment, and mood changes. Let's go over this a little bit. We talked a little bit about this in terms of potential dementia, in terms of neuron breakdown, but also it can lead to brain fog. It can lead to irritability and depression. You will see that in the literature over and over as well. Cognitive impairment associated with statin use. That's a study back in 2009 that shared that. Another one, FDA safety communication acknowledging cognitive side effects, 2012. Again, already well understood that if you're dealing with short-term memory loss, brain fog, or depression, mood-based issues, and you're on a statin drug, even if it takes 6 months to a year, people don't always recognize that it was the statin drug that did it. And it's because it doesn't start right away always. Sometimes it can be 3 months, sometimes 6 months, sometimes a year in. All right, just a couple more to go. Nerve damage and peripheral neuropathy. Talked about this a little bit. The same things that happen in the brain can happen in the body. It can impair the myelin sheath, which is really important. That protects the neurons, nerves themselves. And long-term use is associated with sensory neuropathy in observational-based studies. However, there's good clinical research on this done over 2 decades ago in statin use and risk of polyneuropathy. Okay, what is that? Well, a lot of times people with or taking statin-based drugs start to feel pins and needles, poor circulation, and although they don't necessarily have a direct causal to these statin-based drugs, it shouldn't be denied, and it's been talked about now for about 25 years, since it can interfere with nerve, membrane, cholesterol, and mitochondrial energy-based production. All right, 2 more to go. Increased risk of hemorrhagic stroke. Certainly, again, most likely your doctor's not going to tell you about that, but you need to know that your risk for stroke can go up, which is why even people taking statin-based drugs, they don't necessarily always live longer because there's all of these other side effects. This does happen more in older adults, but lowering cholesterol excessively weakens vascular integrity in the brain. So even if you're eating like healthy cholesterol levels, maybe you're having some eggs or something like that, if your body's not, keep in mind, your liver's producing about 80% of the cholesterol. If your levels are so low, because a lot of physicians love to drive those, not LDL, your total cholesterol below 140, which is equally dangerous, right? If you have cholesterol of 250 and you also have cholesterol below 150, both can be dangerous, right? They absolutely both can be dangerous. Below 150 is not necessarily healthier. The lower your cholesterol, do not fall for that line, does not equate to better health, because we know that there's just as many health issues with very low cholesterol as there is with potentially very high cholesterol. All right, last one I want to share with you is statins reduce physical capability and accelerate aging. Statins impair exercise adaptation. Think about this. You're moving, you're doing your exercise, you're trying to do your cardio, you're trying to improve your VO2 max, you're trying to exercise, keep your muscle on. Well, your statin drugs are directly inhibiting that exercise adaptation. They're making you weaker, muscular, like meaning physically, you're getting weaker on these drugs, and they're reducing your max VO2 improvements. That means your cardiovascular capacity, heart and lungs, getting weaker. And your muscles themselves are getting weaker through the weakening of the mitochondria and potentially the nervous system as well. So, and again, this is all backed up by clinical research. The study's called Statins Reduce Skeletal Muscle Mitochondrial Content and Function, literally done in 2013. I will link it up for you. So here's what we have to decide, right? I mean, this is for all of us to decide. Essentially, any adult 30 plus years old where they're going to start being recommended statin drugs, we have to just decide, do we want to find out the root cause of why we might have unchecked cholesterol, and specifically higher levels of oxidized LDL cholesterol, and maybe even more namely, if you listen to my advanced cholesterol profile, I'll link that up today at stevencabral.com/3637, you start looking at ApoB. All of these things are extremely important for us to look at, because you can be genetically susceptible to higher cholesterol, but you can absolutely keep it within check by natural-based means. I have lots of shows on that without having to revert to statin-based drugs. Now, if a parent, a grandparent, they're not going to do anything. They're not going to change their diet, let's say. They're not going to move more. They're not going to exercise. They're not going to take good nutritional supplements. Then maybe statins are best for them. Again, like I always want what's best for people. And if they're not going to do anything, then they might have a case for actually using these particular drugs. But again, it's not my route. It's not something I would ever recommend to my wellness-based clients or my family. But people do need to decide what they are willing to do and the risk they're willing to take. Hopefully today's show was helpful. Again, I'm not trying to sway you in one direction or another, but I am trying to share with you an unbiased look that most likely your PCP has never shared with you before about one of the most popular prescribed drugs in the world. All right, everybody, all these show note links, the studies, and other pertinent shows will be at stevencabral.com/3637. Have an amazing rest of the day. Do feel free to share the show with anyone you believe it could serve.